Hi, my name is Holly Falk-Krzesinski, and I'm Vice President for Global Strategic Networks at Elsevier, where I'm also co-chair of the Gender Working Group and member of the advisory board of the International Center for the Study of Research. On behalf of my collaborators Rachel Herbert and Andrew Plume, I'm really pleased to be able to share with you the findings of our most recent study, Sustainability Through a Gender Lens, the extent to which research on UN SDGs includes consideration of sex and gender. There were three sources of inspiration and prior work that coalesced into our current study. The first being mainstreaming of gender into SDGs. This is an area that Gender Summits has been promoting for many years now, that all SDG targets should be viewed from a gender perspective to ensure that the outcomes benefit women and men equally. We've seen the same theme come through in UN Women reports, including the Why Gender Equality Matters to Achieving All 17 SDGs that was published in 2018, and the most recent Spotlight on Gender, COVID-19, and the SDGs, Will the Pandemic Derail Hard-Won Progress on Gender Equality? Second was work on gender research analysis from a topical perspective that was included within our 2017 Global Gender Report, in which we conducted cluster analysis and visualization of Scopus data. And then third, some more recent developments, the ability to evaluate research output for every one of the individual SDGs. And we do this through SDG queries or keyword searches, again, against Scopus data. So our approach for the study then was to build the keyword search to identify publications that include sex and/or gender topical research. We did this pulling keywords from a set of publications within a Mendeley library that's public and available to everybody. Then we also invited expert input from Elizabeth Pulitzer and Portia. Next, we identify publications that take into account sex and/or gender research in each of the 16 individual SDGs. We do this using Elsevier's curated SDG publication set and a sex and/or gender term overlap. Then we highlight the SDG research areas in which sex and/or gender research factor for each of the 16 SDGs. We do this using the Voss Viewer mapping tool and building overlay maps. What I'm going to show you now is a select look at our initial results. And the table on the left of this slide, which represents sex and gender research within each SDG corpus. We see the SDGs 1 through 16 are listed with the count of publications identified by that SDG's keyword search or keyword query from 2018 Scopus data. That's the information in the first column. The count and proportion of publications from each SDG corpus also found by the sex and/or gender keyword search is in the second column. And in the third column, the 16 SDGs are in descending proportion order, with SDG 5 having the greatest overlap, followed by SDG 3, and further down to affordable and clean energy at the bottom. The figure on the right graphically represents the data from the table. Now let's look at a few of the SDGs in more detail. Here is a term map for SDG 5, gender equality. The subsequent figures will follow the same schema as what I'm going to share with you about SDG 5. Binary counting was applied to terms in titles and abstracts of SDG 5 publication set. That is, the 6,245 publications from Scopus in 2018 identified using the SDG 5 keyword search or query. And those terms with at least 10 occurrences were then mapped using the Voss Viewer. The node size in the map indicates the count of occurrences, and the node proximity reflects the frequency of co-occurrences. Nodes that are close together co-occur more frequently than nodes that are far apart. The colors indicate topical or thematic clusters of nodes, different areas of research within the SDG overall publication corpus. The topical clusters reveal the diversity of research relevant to SDG 5, targets and indicators. Major clusters of terms relating to gender equality and health on the right side of the map and gender equality and social policy on the left are bridged by a cluster relating to economics of gender inequality at the top of the map, and a less well-defined link between the medical and policy literature around sexual abuse and exploitation appear at the bottom. These topical areas have indistinct boundaries, showing that the interconnectedness of research across domains, but also reflecting how terms may be common across different fields, but might be used in different contexts. For example, the term gender gap, which is up at the top in a central position in the upper bridge of this map, it can be used in different ways, such as in the context of gender gap in pay, or the gender gap in educational opportunities and attainment. This principle applies equally to all maps in the presentation. Also of SDG 5 indicates the proportion of publications associated with SDG 5 mapped terms that were also identified by the sex and gender keyword search, the SDG 5 overlay map. The color scale refers to the share of sex and or gender research overlay score. Most of the SDG 5 overlay map is yellow. Thus, this figure illustrates a high degree of overlap between SDG 5 publication sets and those publications within the corpus tagged as also being identified by the sex and or gender keyword search. In fact, 95% overlap. Very few terms are associated with relatively low proportion of sex and or gender tagged publications, which would be in green nodes, and none of those visible at this scale have no such overlap, which would be seen as purple nodes. SDG 5 gender equality has expected very high coverage of sex and or gender topical research, a confirmation of our methodological approach. Now let's look at 3 additional SDGs. This is SDG 3, good health and well-being, and the term map. The SDG 3 keyword search retrieved an order of magnitude more publications than the next largest SDG. So to work within the processing capability of the VOS viewer, we selected a random 15% of the publications as a subsample and created the map that you see here. The map shows 8 topical clusters relevant to SDG 3's targets and indicators. Starting with health evidence, governance, and policy in red on the left side of the map, reading clockwise, the clusters address clinically oriented research across multiple diseases and conditions in green, and the underlying biology of cancer in purple, fundamental cell biology in blue, and public and environmental health in yellow. In the center of the map, there are smaller clusters of terms, and they relate to genetics and genomics in orange, immunology in light blue, and virology in brown. And here we see the SDG 3 sex and or gender overlay map. SDG 3 is considered a gender-sensitive topic by the UN Women 2018 report. What we see is that there is a high proportion of SDG 3 publications that are also identified by the sex and or gender keyword search, 61% overlap. The strong overlap between these 2 keyword searches is not unexpected. What is perhaps surprising, though, is that the sex and gender topical research is unevenly spread across SDG 3. The terms in this map associated with publications that do not include sex and or gender terms are largely in the topical clusters relating to fundamental cell biology and public and environmental health. This is despite calls for sex and gender to be incorporated and reported in research areas across the spectrum of human health. Such calls recognize that our understanding of the underlying causes of poor health and effective prevention and treatment require attention to sex and or gender disaggregation in studies in published research literature. As a topical example, despite emerging evidence that COVID-19 patient outcomes are different for men and women, terms relating to coronavirus and the COVID-19 relative Middle East respiratory MERS, they appear among those terms least associated with sex and or gender in the lower part of the map. Here is SDG 4's quality education term map. Pedagogy is the theory and practice of teaching and learning, and research relevant to this field is represented in this map by 2 distinct topical clusters. On the left of the map, the red clusters represent terms relating to teaching and teacher training, higher education, and education policy. On the right, the green cluster includes topics dealing primarily with educational settings from early years, preschool and kindergarten, through to high school or secondary education. As noted in previous maps, the definition of these clusters, especially near the edges, is imperfect. For example, at the bottom of the green cluster, there is a set of terms relating to medical school students that's slightly disconnected from the rest of the cluster and might be considered a distinct subcluster. Here is the SDG 4 sex and gender overlay map. SDG 4 is classed as gender sensitive by the UN Women Report. And for many years, it's been known that the formative educational experiences and educational attainment are different for boys and girls. However, it's also become clear more recently that teacher or professor gender in higher education affects attainment and outcomes for women, but not for men. The overlay map appears to reflect this, with sex and gender research in the publications addressing topics around early years, junior and senior high school education, but almost absent from the part of the map that deals with higher education and teacher training. Thus, we see sex and gender research within SDG 4 is explicit in education practice, but not education policy research. The final term map is for SDG 13, climate action, and the breadth of topics that this global challenge encompasses. The blue cluster at the bottom left is focused on atmospheric, terrestrial, and ocean climate monitoring and modeling, closely linked to the yellow cluster with a focus on paleoclimate and historic sea level changes. The green cluster covers climate change effects and adaptation in the biosphere, and the red cluster relates to energy production and the use of climate governance and policy. And the corresponding sex and gender overlay map. SDG 13 is considered gender sparse according to the UN Women classification, and we see that SDG 13, climate action, has very low coverage of sex and/or gender topical research. With an overlap of only 4% of publications found by both the SDG 13 keyword query and the sex and gender keyword query, SDG 13 contrasts starkly with SDG 5, gender equality, in that it has very few terms associated with relatively high proportion of sex and or gender tagged publications, thus almost entirely purple nodes. However, evidence is building that women and men experience climate effects differently, partly as a result of the intersection between gender, poverty, and political engagement that results in gender inequalities. Moreover, global negotiations have increasingly reflected the growing understanding of gender considerations in climate decision-making over the last 8 years. This suggests a need for more climate action research that takes into consideration sex and/or gender-related inquiries. Having evaluated all 16 SDGs and closely analyzed SDG 5, SDG 3, SDG 4, and SDG 13 in detail at this point of our study, we draw the following conclusions. The extent to which sex and/or gender research factors into SDG research varies both within individual and across the 16 SDGs. SDG 5, Gender Equality, and SDG 3, Good Health and Well-being, are the only two SDGs with greater than 60% of the publications factoring in sex and/or gender. The remaining 14 SDGs have fewer than 40% of publications that include sex and/or gender research. While some SDGs may not have an obvious link to the need for sex and/or gender analysis, there's a growing recognition that sex and gender must be factored in from the research design stage to ensure rigorous results and impactful policy. We intend for the results of the study to stimulate lots of great discussion and to think about the much needed requirements for gender analysis factors in SDG research, as well as providing a benchmark for further development and longitudinal studies of this important dimension to sustainability research. We hope that this will inspire lots of questions, and we invite you to reach out and contact us. So here you will find the ways to reach us at the International Center for the Study of Research and the direct email addresses and/or Twitter accounts for Rachel, Andrew, and myself. Thank you very much, and we hope to hear from many of you. Thank you.